Around 3:40 a.m. on August 31st, 1888, Charles Cross was making his way to work on Bucks Row, a cobbled Whitechapel street that was lined on one side by warehouse buildings and on the other by a row of two-story houses. As Cross approached the looming bulk of the 1876 board school that dominated the western end of Bucks Row, he noticed something lying in the gateway, just off to the left side of the street. Like so many of the district's alleyways and passageways, street lighting in Bucks Row was minimal, so at first, Cross could not be sure what the bundle was. It looked like something like a discarded tarpaulin, so Cross went to inspect it. But as he drew closer, he realized it was in fact the prone form of a woman, who was either dead or drunk. As Cross stood, rooted to the spot and unsure of what to do next, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Robert Paul walking towards him. "Come over here and look at this," Cross called. "There's a woman lying on the pavement." The two men stepped gingerly over the road and stooped down over her. She was lying on her back, her legs straight out, her skirt was raised almost over her waist. Charles Cross reached out and touched her face, which was warm, and her hands were cold and limp. "I believe she's dead," he observed. Robert Paul, meanwhile, placed his hand on the woman's chest and thought he felt a slight movement. "I think she's breathing," he said, "but very little if she is." Paul suggested they sit the woman up, but Cross refused to touch her again. So deciding, perhaps somewhat callously, that they were late for work and had done as much as they could, they pulled her skirts back down over her knee to cover her decency and set off for their respective place of employment, agreeing to tell the first policeman they encountered of their find. But what neither man noticed in the pitch darkness of Bucks Row was the woman's throat had been slashed so savagely that her head had almost been cut from her body. So it was in the early hours of August in 1888 that the serial killer known as Jack the Ripper's first confirmed victim was found. This would not be the last of Jack, as a series of brutal and violent murders kept London's Whitechapel District and even the whole of Europe gripped in fear. Jack the Ripper was a name given to a serial killer from 1888 who was believed to have killed at least 5 women in the Whitechapel District of London. It is believed that his killing spree went from August 31st to November 9th, though there were several other murders thought to have been his doing. His 5 known victims were all prostitutes and were brutally mutilated after having their throats cut. In some cases, they had body parts removed, like in the case of Annie Chapman, whose womb was removed and taken by Jack. On one occasion, half a kidney was mailed to the police, though it was uncertain if this came from one of Jack's victims, but is widely believed to have had. Before we dive into Jack's story some more, we must first understand what it was like in Whitechapel in 1888. Gas lamp-lit streets, dark, foggy alleyways didn't offer the residents of Whitechapel an inspiring backdrop by which to relive their lives. The area was steeped in poverty and all manners of crime and disease. Growing up in this part of London offered a challenge in itself. Many children were seen as a strain on their parents' resources, and it is believed that 2 in every 10 died before reaching the age of 5. Victorian London wasn't a happy place to be, and the facts speak for themselves. Prostitution was rife, poverty and crime were prevalent, and the 19th century housing was barely habitable. Finding work in 1888 was extremely difficult for the residents of Whitechapel, feeding into the cycle of destitution and depravity. Whitechapel offered a breeding ground for crime and poor behavioral habits, including murder, prostitution, and violence. And vicious cycles like these were rarely broken into such poor districts. The streets were unimaginably dirty, fresh food was hard to come by, pollution and the smell of sewage hung in the air. Life was much harder for women, though. The lack of proper work and money led to many women and girls into prostitution, a service in high demand by those wishing to escape the grim realities. The women, commonly referred to as the unfortunates, owned only what they wore and carried in their pockets. Their deeds would pay for their bed for the night. However, a lack of contraception meant that unorthodox abortions were performed in dirty facilities, including the back streets. This, of course, fed into the cycle of disease, and many women would die from infections from these ill-performed surgeries or from ingesting chemicals or poisons. While the streets were lined with the starving, penniless inhabitants of the drab and dark capital, the insides of the houses throughout the borough were no less uninviting and more reminiscent of slums. Many were makeshift brothels, offering a bed and a room to those wishing for a short-term escape. However, this was a dangerous trade, as diseases were passed from person to person very quickly, and doctors did not come cheap. Housing was also extremely overcrowded, with entire families or groups of strangers crammed into a single room for cooking, eating, and sleeping. They would share beds or sleep on the floor, with rags covering broken windows and often flea or insect-infested environments. These damp and cold conditions offered an ideal climate for further disease and sickness to develop. Surviving in the late 19th centuries often came through casual or sweated labor, like tailoring, bootmaking, making matchboxes. These professions came with very little job security, and the work premises would be more like a small, cramped, dusty room with little to no natural light. Workhouses were another alternative, set up to offer food and shelter to the poorest of the community in return for hard, grueling labor and even worse conditions. These horrible working and living conditions resulted in large portions of the population turning to drink or to drugs to cope with their everyday problems. Pubs and music halls were mainly in number in the East End, and drink was cheap too, making it a variable means of escapism for many. It comes to no surprise that, as a result, crime rates spiraled and were unimaginable by London's police force in 1888. Petty crime like street theft was commonplace, alongside more serious disturbances like alcohol-related violence, gang crime, and even protection rackets. The high level of prostitution meant that vulnerable women were often forced to earn a living on the streets, leaving them easy targets for assault, rape, and even murder. Police stations and the detectives at the helm lacked structure and organization, with many crimes being mislabeled, evidence going missing or even being tampered with, and, in the case of Jack the Ripper, violent sexual killers left to roam the streets of London. The maze of dingy alleyways and dark courtyards, each with multiple entrances and exit points, only made the district even more difficult to police. There were even some parts of Whitechapel that police officers were afraid to enter, making them crime hotspots. And so here we are, the hunting ground of the world's most notorious killer, Jack the Ripper. In the official police reports, he's referred to as the Whitechapel murderer and the apron. It wasn't until the newspapers started referring to him as the Ripper that the name became known, but we'll get more onto that later. So we know about the canonical five, so let's talk about possible victims before those. The first of these victims was Emma Smith, who was attacked in the early hours of April 3, 1888. At a quarter after midnight on the morning of Tuesday, April 3rd, Margaret Hayes, a fellow lodger at 18 George Street, saw Emma talking with a man who was wearing dark clothing and who had sported a white neckerchief. Between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, Emma Smith returned to 18 George Street, where Mary Russell became immediately concerned at the state that she was in. Her face was bleeding, Mary Lady recalled. Her ear was badly cut, and she said she was so injured in the lower parts of her body. Emma had told Mary that she had been shockingly maltreated by some men as she was making her way along Osborne Street in the dirty, narrow entrance to Brick Lane. On arrival at the London hospital, Emma Smith seen Dr. George Halsip, the house surgeon. He later testified that, although she had probably been drinking, she was not intoxicated and he knew what she was about. On examining her, he found the injuries that she had suffered were truly horrific. A portion of her right ear was torn, and the peritoneum and other internal organs had just been ruptured, which, he later stated, led him to believe that the injuries had been caused by some blunt instrument having been thrust into her with very great force. He asked her how she had come by these injuries, to which she replied that she had been walking past Whitechapel Church about 1:30 on Tuesday evening when she saw some men approaching. She had crossed over the road to avoid them, but they had proceeded to follow her along Osborne Street, where they assaulted her, robbed her of all her money, and then committed the outrage. There were, she told the doctor, 2 or 3 men. One of them looked like a young youth about 19. She was, Halsip later stated, somewhat reticent with regards to the details, but she distinctly denied having addressed the men in solicitation. She could not tell whether it was a knife or what instrument that had been used on her. She had later died of her injuries in a London hospital, and as a result, hers became the first name to appear in the Whitechapel murder files. Emma Smith was, almost certainly, not a victim of Jack, but indeed, before she died, she was able to tell the doctor that she would treat her at the London hospital that she had been attacked by a local gang. A few months later, on the 7th of August of 1888, the body of Martha Tambrin was found in George Yard, a sordid thoroughfare that led, and for what that matters still leads, off Whitechapel High Street. She had been subjected to a horrendous attack and a very violent attack, in the course in which she had sustained 39 frenzied stab wounds to her throat, chest, and abdomen. Martha Tambrin, who was also known as Martha Turner, may or may not have been a victim of Jack the Ripper. The case against her having been a victim is that her throat hadn't been cut and that she hadn't been disemboweled, injuries that almost all of the canonical 5 victims had later endured. Evidence that suggests she was a victim is that her killer had targeted her throat and her abdomen, just like Jack the Ripper did in the 5 canonical victims. It's therefore safe to say that the jury is most certainly still out on whether or not Martha was a Ripper victim. Now, I've included these two because when you talk about Jack the Ripper, you got to understand that we're also talking about the Whitechapel murders. It's a whole series of files with a bunch of victims that can or cannot be linked to the same amount of time. So now we're going to take a look at the actual canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. First in the canonical victims was Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly Nichols, as she was often called by her family, friends, and acquaintances. She was born Mary Ann Walker on the 26th of August in 1845 at Dawes Court, off Shoe Lane in the city of London. She was the second of 3 children of Edward and Caroline Walker. In October of 1887, Mary had joined the hundreds of homeless who had been sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square, many of whom ignored the order issued on Monday the 23rd of October by Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren to vacate the square, and who were, therefore, arrested and charged with wandering abroad without any visible means of sustenance. On the morning of Tuesday, the 25th of October, 1887, those who had been taken into custody the previous night appeared at Bow Street Police Court, and amongst them was Mary Ann Nichols. It isn't certain whether this was Mary Ann Nichols who, within a year, would become the first of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, but if it was, the newspapers was somewhat unflattering about her, describing her as the worst woman in the square, and going on to say that the police station she was very disorderly. By early August of 88, Mary Ann Nichols had made her way to the east end of London, where she moved into Wilmot's, a female-only common lodging house at 18 Thrall Street in Spitalfields. Here she was known as other residents as Polly. She shared a room with 3 other women, one of whom was an elderly lady by the name of Emily Holland, who was also referred to in some reports as Ellen Holland, with whom Mary became very friendly. Emily would later remember Mary as having been a very clean woman who kept to herself as if she was melancholy, and who gave her the impression of being weighed down by some trouble, although she did concede that she had seen Mary the worse for drink once or twice. Emily also stated that Mary never used to be fond of men, adding that, "I don't think she was a fast woman." On the 24th of August of 88, Mary left Wilmot's and went to reside at a mixed-sex lodge house known as the White House, which was situated at 56 Flower and Dean Street, Spitalfields. Here she had spent her last 43rd birthday on August 26 of 1888. At 3:30 a.m. on the 31st of August, Charles Cross left his home on Doveton Street, Benthall Green, and set off to walk to his place of work at Pickford's near Liverpool Street, where he was employed as a carman and a delivery driver. Heading along Brady Street, he turned into Bucks Row and commenced walking along his right side. As he approached the looming bulk of the 1876 board school, which dominated and still dominates the west end of the first section of the Bucks Row, he noticed a dark bundle lying in the gateway of the opposite side of the street. As with many of the district's thoroughfares, street lighting in Bucks Row was minimal, so at first Cross could not be sure exactly what the bundle was. It looked like something of a discarded tarpaulin or so. Thinking it may prove useful for his job, Cross went to inspect it, but as he drew closer, he realized that it was in fact the prone form of a woman who was either dead or drunk, and he stopped in his tracks. As Cross stood, rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do next, he heard footsteps approaching from the direction he had just come. Turning, he saw another carter, Robert Paul, walking towards him. "Come and look over here," Cross called. "There's a woman lying on the pavement." 2 men stepped over the road and swooped down over the prostrate figure. She was lying on her back, her legs were straight out, and her skirt was raised almost over her waist. Charles Cross reached out and touched her face, which was warm, and her hands were cold and limp. "I believe she's dead," he observed. Robert Paul, meanwhile, placed his hand on the woman's chest and thought he felt a slight movement. I think she's breathing. But very little if she is. Paul suggested they sit the woman up, but Cross refused to touch her again. So deciding, perhaps somewhat callously, that they were late for work and had done as much as they could, they pulled her skirt back down to her knees to cover her decency and set off to their respective places of employment, agreeing to tell the first policeman they encountered of their find. But what neither man had noticed in the pitch darkness of Bucks Row was that the woman's throat had been slashed so savagely that, according to some newspaper reports, her head had almost been severed from her body. Dr. Lewin arrived around 4 a.m. and carried out a cursory examination of the body. Noting that the severity of the wounds to the throat, he had pronounced life extinct. On closer examination, he also observed that the deceased's body and legs were still warm, although her hands and wrists were quite cold. This led him to surmise that she could not have been dead for more than half an hour. In fact, this observation by the doctor suggests the murderer may have well been at the scene when Cross came strolling along Bucks Row on his way to work. While Mary is generally believed to be the first victim of Jack the Ripper, her throat had been slit twice from left to right and her abdomen mutilated with one deep, jagged wound, several incisions across the abdomen, and 3 or 4 small similar cuts on the right side caused by the same knife, estimated to be between 6 to 8 inches long, used violently and downwards. The second victim of the canonical 5 was Annie Chapman. Annie Chapman had led a somewhat nomadic existence around Spatenfields. She was 47 years old at the time of her death, a short, plump, ashen-faced consumptive who, for 4 or so months prior to her death, had been living at Crossingham's lodge house at number 35 Dorset Street, where she paid 8 pence a night for a double bed. She appears to have enjoyed a cordial relationship with the other tenants and the deputy keeper, Timothy Donovan. He remembered her as being an inoffensive soul whose main weakness was a fondness for drink. Like many of the women in the area, Annie supplemented her meager income she obtained from crochet work and making and selling artificial flowers with prostitution. At about 5 p.m. on September 7th, Annie's friend Amelia said she saw Annie in Dorset Street. She had complained of feeling too ill to do anything. She was still standing in the same place when Amelia passed her again 10 minutes later, although she was now trying desperately to rally her spirits. "There's no use giving away. I must pull myself together and get some money, or I shall have no lodgings," was the last words Amelia Palmer heard Annie Chapman speak. A little before 6 a.m., John Davis, an elderly resident of 29 Hanbury Street, came downstairs, walked along a narrow passageway, and opened up the back door. The sight that met his eyes sent him reeling back in horror. Moments later, 2 workmen walking along Hanbury Street were suddenly startled from the open door of 29. A wide-eyed old man came crumbling into the street. "Man," he cried, "come here." Nervously, they followed him along the passageway, and looking into the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, they saw the mutilated body of Annie Chapman laying on the ground between the steps and the wooden fence. Her head was turned towards the house, and her clothes had been tugged up above her waist, exposing her red and white striped stockings. A handkerchief was tied around her throat. She had been wearing this when the killer cut her throat, and it had it not, as had often been asserted, been tied to the murderer to stop the head from rolling away. Her face and hands were covered in blood, and her hands were raised and bent with the palms upward towards the upper position of her body, giving James Kent the impression that she had been struggling and had fought at her throat. After a few moments of stunned silence, the 3 men sprang into action and, racing out of the house, set off in directions to find the policeman. The horror of what he had witnessed immediately began to sink in with James Kent, causing him to abandon his search and go instead for the brandy to steady his nerves. Henry Holland raced up Commercial Street and headed across the Spatenfields Market, where he encountered a constable on fixed point duty. Holland panted out the news of their find, and somewhat taken back when the officer curtly informed him that it was against procedure for him to leave his post. He was so angered by the officer's atrocious attitude that he later made an official complaint to the Commercial Street Police Station, only to be told that the officer had been correct to follow the procedure and not leave his post. John Davis, meanwhile, headed to the Commercial Street Police Station and, bursting through his door, breathlessly demanded to see the senior officer. Moments later, Inspector Joseph Chandler was hurrying along Commercial Street. Turning along Hanbury Street, he forced his way through the inspectors who were already gathering there at the passage of number 29. He ordered that the vicinity be cleared of all sightseers and then sent the constable back to Commerce Street Police Station, instructing him to bring as many reinforcements as possible in order that the crowds may be contained. Another officer was dispatched to fetch Dr. George Baxter Phillips, a divisional police surgeon. Chandler then acquired some sacking from one of the neighbors and used it to cover the body until the arrival of the police surgeon. By the time Phillips arrived around 6:30 a.m., the crowd outside the house was some several hundred strong. Casting a cursory glance down at the body, it was more obvious to him that the woman was beyond medical help. His testimony at the inquest recalled what he had saw. The left arm was placed across the left breast. The legs were drawn up, the feet resting on the ground, and the knees turned upwards. The face was swollen and turned onto the right side. The tongue protruded between the front teeth, but not beyond the lips. The tongue was evidently much more swollen. The front teeth were perfect as far as the first molar, top and bottom, and very fine teeth they were. The body was terribly mutilated. The stiffness of the limbs was not marked, but was evidently commencing. He noticed that the throat had been dissevered deeply, that the incisions through the skin were jagged and reaching around the neck. On the wooden paling between the yard in question and the next, smears of blood corresponding to where the head of the deceased lay were to be seen. They were about 14 inches from the ground and immediately above the part where the body and the neck lay. Later that day, the postmortem revealed that the killer had deftly cut out Annie Chapman's womb and had gone off with it. Jack's third and perhaps the most famous of his canonical 5 victims was Elizabeth Stride. After an absence of several weeks, the killer returned to the streets of East London on the 30th of September and claimed the lives of 2 women, within an hour of each other. The first victim of what was dubbed the night of the double event was Elizabeth Stride, and it seems highly likely that her killer was interrupted in the act of murder. Elizabeth, or Long Liz Stride, spent the last afternoon of her life cleaning rooms at the lodging house at number 32 Flower and Dean Street, where she had lived on and off for the previous 6 years. The deputy keeper, Elizabeth Tanner, paid her 6 pence for the chores, and by 6:30, Lizzie was slacking her thirst in the nearby Queen's Head pub at the junction of Fashion and Commercial Streets. By 7 p.m., she had returned to the lodging house and was, according to fellow resident Charles Preston, for whom she had borrowed a clothes brush, dressed, ready to go out. Having chatted briefly with another lodger, Catherine Lane, Lizzie Stride left the lodging house at around 7:30. At 1 a.m., Louis Deschmoltz, the steward in International Working Men's Education Club, returned to Duffield's yard from West Hill Market, near Crystal Palace, where he had spent the day hawking the cheap jewelry. As he turned his pony cart into the yard, his pony shied to the left and refused to go any further. Looking into the yard, Dean Schultz saw a dark form lying on the ground of the wall of the club. Leaning forward, he prodded it with his whip and tried to lift it. When this proved unsuccessful, he jumped down to investigate and struck a match to get a better view. It was windy that night, and the match was extinguished almost immediately. But in the brief second flittering light, he saw that it was a woman lying on the ground. Thinking that it might be his wife, he went to the club by the side entrance and, finding his wife safe, told several club members, "There's a woman in the yard. I can't say if she's dead or drunk." Taking a candle, Dean Schultz returned to the yard with several other club members. Now he noticed blood by the body, and those present winced in horror when they saw that the woman's throat had been cut. The various club members rushed to the yard and hurried off to the surrounding streets to find the police constable. Dean Schultz and his companion headed along Fairlaw Street, shouting, "Murder!" and "Police!" At its junction with Christian Street, they met Edward Spooner. He asked what all the fuss was about when they told him when he returned to the Duffield's yard where around 15 people were already gathered. Spooner stooped down, lifted the woman's chin, and found it slightly warm. As Spooner tilted the head back, Dean Schultz got his first glimpse of just how terrible the wound to her throat was. "I could see that her throat was fairly cut," he told the journalist later that day. "It was a great gash in it, over 2 inches wide." A stream of blood ran from the woman's throat up to the yard towards the door of the club. There was a doubled-up piece of paper in the woman's right hand, which it later transpired to be a pack of coaches or breath fresheners. Morris Eagle, another club member, headed out Berners Street and gone right along Commercial Road. Here he met PC Henry Lamb and told him, "Come on, there's been another murder." Lamb alerted PC Edward Collins, and together they found the 2 men back at Duffield's yard, where the crowd had now swelled to some 20 or 30 people. Lamb ordered the bystanders to keep back lest they get blood on their clothing and find themselves in trouble, and told Collins to go at once for Dr. Frederick William Blackwell, who lived at 100 Commercial Street. He then sent Morris Eagle to Lemon Street Police Station to summon further assistance. As the two men headed off, Lamb stooped down again and felt the woman's face, finding that it was still slightly warm. However, when he felt her wrist, he could detect no sign of a pulse. When asked by the coroner of the subsequent inquest whether the woman's clothing had been disturbed, Lamb replied, "No, I could scarcely see her boots. She had looked like she had quietly just laid down." Dr. Blackwell arrived at the yard about 1:16 a.m. and, having pronounced the woman dead, gave it his opinion that she had been dead for about 20 to 30 minutes. He noted that the woman was wearing a check silk scarf, and the bow of which was turned to the left and pulled tightly. At the inquest, he stated that he had formed an opinion that the killer had first taken hold of the back of the silk scarf and pulled the victim backwards onto the ground. He, however, couldn't be certain whether the woman's throat had been cut while she was standing or after she had been pulled backwards. Once the killer had cut her throat, slicing through the windpipe, she would not have been able to cry out and would have bled to death within about a minute and a half. Unlike the other four canonical Ripper victims, Stride had not been mutilated following her murder, leading some historians to suspect Stride had not actually been murdered by Jack. However, Stride's murder occurred less than an hour before the murder of the Ripper's fourth canonical victim. The fourth canonical victim was Catherine Eddowes. At more or less the exact same moment that Elizabeth Stride was being discovered in Duffield's yard, another prostitute named Catherine, or Kate Eddowes, was being released from Bishopsgate Police Station in the City of London. Discharging her from custody, Hutt pushed open the door and swung to the passage and said, "This way, missus." As she walked along the passage to the outer door, she asked him what time it was. "Too late for you to get any more drink," observed Hutt. "I shall get a damn fine hiding when I get home," she sighed as she opened the door. Hutt was not at least bit sympathetic. "And you deserve right. You have no right to get drunk." As Kate left the station, Hutt asked her to shut the door behind her. "All right," she chirped. "Good night, old cock." She turned left and headed towards Houndsditch. According to Hutt's later estimation, it could have taken around 8 minutes, ordinarily a walk, to reach Midas Square, during which time the murderer of Elizabeth Stride was also heading towards the square from the opposite direction. At 1:30 a.m., P.C. Watkins of the City Police passed this southeast corner on a beat that brought him through Midas Square every 12 to 14 minutes. He had his lantern on and fixed to his belt. He was later emphatic that the square had been quite deserted and no one could have been hiding in the square without him seeing them. He left the square and turned right toward Applegate. 5 minutes later, 3 Jewish gentlemen, Harry Harris, Joseph Hiram Levy, and Joseph Lundale, left the Imperial Club on Duke Street, and as they passed the junction with Church Passage, noticed a man and woman walking quietly together. The woman had her back to them, but they could see that her hand was resting on the man's chest. Levy was immediately convinced that they were a couple, but they were up to no good, and announced brusquely, "I don't like going home by myself when I can see the sorts of characters about." In his hurry to get away, he paid the couple scant attention and was unable to furnish a description of either of them, although he did say that the man had been 3 or so inches taller than the woman. Joseph Lundy, however, was a less disgusted and a little more observant. Although he hadn't seen the woman's face, he was almost certain that her clothing was worn by Catherine Eddowes when she was later shown at the police station. Although the street lighting wasn't particularly good, he caught a brief glimpse of the man's face and was able to provide police with a description. He had the appearance of a sailor and was aged about 30. He was around 5'9" and of medium build. He had a fair complexion and a small figure mustache. He sported a reddish neckerchief tied in a knot, wore a pepper and salt covered loose fitting jacket, and had a gray peaked cloth cap. However, it should be noted that Lundale obtained only a quick glimpse of the man as he passed by, and since the couple were doing nothing particularly suspicious, he later maintained that he would not be able to recognize or identify the man if he were ever to see him again. Since Catherine's body was discovered just 15 minutes later in Midas Square, a few steps before Lundale saw the couple, there was a high probability that the man he saw was the murderer of Catherine Eddowes. Her injuries were absolutely horrific. Her face was very disfigured and her throat was cut. A handkerchief was found tied around her neck. Her abdomen had been mutilated and her intestines were drawn out and thrown over her right shoulder. Fecal matter was noted smeared all over them. Her body was quite warm, leading medical examiners to believe that she had been dead only about a half an hour. As in other cases, the mutilation was discovered to have happened after death. The left kidney had been carefully removed. This had led investigators to believe that the killer had some great knowledge of the positions of the organs in the abdominal cavity. The final victim of the canonical five was Mary Kelly. After the double event, the whole of October passed with no further murders, and by the end of the month, the area as a whole had breathed a sigh of relief as the residents believed the murders had come to an end. That all changed around 4 a.m. on the morning of November 9th, when two neighbors claimed that they heard the faint cry of, "Oh, murder!" But cries of murder were quite regular occurrence in the neighborhood, and often meant a drunken brawl was taking place or a domestic violence was occurring. It was quite customary for those on the receiving end of such violence to scream murder. The local residents didn't want to get involved, so they could ignore such cries, and indeed did the two neighbors of Mary Kelly ignore the cry that they heard. At 10:45 that morning, Mary Kelly's landlord John McCarthy sent his assistant Thomas Boyer, who was also known as Indian Harry, round to 13 Miller's Court to collect her overdue rent. Striding into Miller's Court, Boyer banged on the door twice. There was no answer. No doubt believing that she was either unwilling or unable to pay her rent, Boyer stepped around the corner and pulled aside a curtain that covered the broken window pane. Moments later, an ashen-faced Bower staggered back into McCarthy's shop. "Governor? I knocked at the door, and I couldn't make anyone answer. I looked through the window, and I saw a lot of blood." "You don't mean that, Harry," was McCarthy's horrified response, and the two men hurried from the shop into Miller's Court. Stooping down, McCarthy pushed aside a curtain and gazed into the gloomy room. A sight of unimaginable horror met his eyes. The wall behind the bed was spattered with blood. On the bedside table was a pile of bloody human flesh, and there on the bed, barely recognized as a human being, lay the virtually skinned cadaver of Mary Kelly. "The sight we saw cannot drive away from my mind," McCarthy later told the journalist. "It looked more like the work of a devil than those of a man. I heard a great deal about the Whitechapel murders, but I declare to God I never expected to see such sights as this. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight again." McCarthy sent Bower to Commercial Street police station to fetch the police, and having first stopped to secure his shop, hurried after him. Inspectors Walter Drew and Walter Beck were chatting inside the station when Bower arrived. As Drew recalled in his memoirs, the poor fellow was so frightened for the time that he was unable to utter a single intelligible word. At last he managed to stammer out something about another one, Jack the Ripper, awful Jack McCarthy sent me. Soon Beck and Drew were following Dwyer along the Commercial Street in the direction of Dorset Street. When they arrived at Miller's Court, Drew tried the door, but it wouldn't open. Inspector Beck therefore moved to the window and gazed into the room. Almost instantly he staggered back. "For God's sake, Drew, don't look!" Drew ignored this order, and looking through the windows, saw a sight that would stay with him till his dying day. The horror of what he saw was still vivid in his mind when he penned his memoirs 50 years later. As my thoughts go back to Miller Court and what happened there, the old nausea, indignation, and horror overwhelm me still. My mental picture of it remains as shockingly clear as though it were yesterday. No savage could have been more barbaric. No wild animal could have done anything so horrifying. Mary Kelly's body lay on the bed, her head turned toward the window. Her face had been mutilated beyond recognition, and one of the features in particular struck Inspector Drew. The poor woman's eyes. They were wide open and seemed to be staring right at me as in a look of terror. Indeed, so thorough were the mutilations to Mary Kelly's face that her lover, Joseph Barnett, was only later able to identify her by her eyes and her ears. Unlike the other four canonical Ripper victims, each of whom had been murdered outdoors and whose mutilations could have been committed within minutes, Kelly was murdered within the furnished single room she rented at 13 Miller's Court, affording her murderer an extensive period of time to eviscerate and mutilate her body. Kelly's body was far more the most extensively mutilated of the canonical victims, with her mutilations taking her murderer approximately 2 hours to perform. The whole surface of her abdomen and thighs were removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of its features. The tissues of the neck were severed all around down to the bone. The viscera were found in various parts: the uterus and kidneys with one breast under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side of the body. The flaps removed from the abdomen and thighs were on the table. The bed clothing at the right corner was saturated with blood, and the floor beneath was a pool of blood covering about 2 feet square. The wall by the right side of the bed, in line with the neck, was marked by the blood, which had struck it in several places. The face was gashed in all directions, the nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears being partially removed. The lips were blanched and cut by several incisions running obliquely down to the chin. There were also numerous cuts extending irregularly across all the features. The neck was cut so through the skin and the other tissues right down to the vertebrae, the fifth and sixth being deeply notched. The air passage was cut at the lower part of the larynx through the carotid cartilage. Both breasts were more or less removed by circular incisions, and the muscles down to the ribs being attached to the breasts. The intercostals between the fourth, fifth, and sixth ribs were cut through, and the contents of the thorax visible through the openings. The skin and tissue of the abdomen from the costal arches to the pubes were removed in 3 large flaps. The right thigh was denuded in front of the bone, the flap of skin including the external organs of generation and part of the right buttocks. The left thigh was stripped of skin fascia, the muscles, and as far as the knee. The left calf showed a long gash through the skin and tissues to the deep muscles and reaching to the knee to 5 inches above the ankle. Both arms and forearms had extensive jagged wounds. The right thumb showed a small superficial incision about 1 inch long, with extra vision of blood in the skin, and there were several abrasions on the back of the hand, moreover showing the same condition. It was believed she was killed by the slash to the throat, and the mutilations were performed afterwards. The subsequent murders that follow are from the Whitechapel murder files, and they are believed to be victims of Jack, but were later dismissed as either possible copycats or not linked to Jack at all. Alice Mackenzie. At 12:50 a.m. on the 17th of July, 1889, Constable Walter Andrews found the body of local prostitute Alice Mackenzie laying close to a lamppost on the pavement in Castle Alley, just off of Whitechapel High Street. Her skirt had been pulled up and there was blood over her thigh and abdomen, which transpired was coming from a zigzag, albeit fairly superficial, wound that ran from just beneath her left breast to her navel. The divisional police surgeon, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, was summoned, and having examined the body, he pronounced life extinct. Dr. Phillips later reported that the woman's injuries did not suggest to him that this was the work of Jack the Ripper. There was, however, disagreement as to whether Alice Mackenzie's murder was marked in the Ripper's return. James Monroe, who had taken over as police commissioner from Sir Charles Warren, arrived at the scene of the murder just after 3 a.m. Later that day, he reported to the Home Office that every effort will be made to discover the murderer, who, I am inclined to believe, is identical to the notorious Jack the Ripper of last year. Dr. Thomas Bond, who examined the body of Alice Mackenzie at the mortuary, was also of the opinion that the injuries suggested that this was another Ripper killing. Dr. Phillips, on the other hand, opinion that the wounds were not severe enough to suggest that it was the Jack the Ripper style killing. Robert Anderson, who was away on holiday at the time of Alice Mackenzie's murder, was later adamant that this murder was not the work of Jack and stated that the murder of Alice Mackenzie was by another hand. Anderson also suggested that Monroe had later changed his opinion and had come to believe that her murder was just an ordinary murder and not the work of a sexual maniac. The Pinchin Street Torso. On Wednesday, 11th of September 1889, under a sensational headline that ended "Mystery of Mysteries," the New York Herald told its readers that the London in general and Whitechapel in particular were thrown into a feverish state of excitement yesterday morning by the news that Jack the Ripper had murdered and mutilated his 9th victim. Both the murder and mutilation were reported to be, and indeed proved to be, more horrible than any of the other 8 cases preceding. On the same day, Metropolitan Police Commissioner James Monroe forwarded a 7-page report to the Home Office regarding the finding of the trunk of a female, minus head and legs, in one of the railway arches in Pinchin Street. More then went on to explain that the street is close to Brunner Street, which was the scene of the previous Whitechapel murders, that of Elizabeth Stride. It is not a very narrow street, but it is lonely at night and is patrolled every half hour by a constable on beat. The arch where the body was found abuts to the pavement. The constable discovered the body somewhat after 20 minutes past 5 in the morning of Tuesday, September 10th. He is positive that when he passed the spot about 5, the body was not there. It may therefore be assumed that the body was placed there when found sometime between 5 and 5:30. Although the body was placed in the arch on Tuesday morning, the murder, and although there is not yet more for me to believe proof of such a cause of death, I assume that there has been a murder, was not committed there nor then. There was almost no blood in the arch, and the state of the body itself showed that the death had taken place about 36 hours or more previously. This then enables me to say that the woman was made away with properly on Sunday night, September 8th. This was the date of one of which the previous Whitechapel murders, that of Annie Chapman, was committed. James Monroe, in his report on the 11th of September of '89, entered into a detailed comparison to the murder with the previous Whitechapel atrocities and observed that, in this fresh outrage by the Whitechapel murderer, known by the horribly familiar nickname of Jack the Ripper, this murder committed in the murderer's house would be a new departure from the system hitherto pursued by this ruffian. I am, however, inclined to believe that this case was not of the work of the Ripper. Monroe went on to state that in the previous cases, death had been caused by cutting to the throat, whereas in the case of the Pinchin Street victim, there was nothing to show that death was caused by the throat having been cut. Whereas in the previous cases, the bodies had been mutilated, in this latest case, there was no mutilation other than the dismemberment. Previous victims had suffered evisceration, but the Pinchin Street victim was most certainly hadn't. In several of the previous cases, there had been removal of certain body parts, whereas in the Pinchin Street victim, there is no removal of any portion of the organs or generalization or intestines. Concerning the location of the previous murders, Monroe pointed out that they had all been committed in the street, except in the one instance on Dorset Street, where there were distinct traces of furious mania, the murderer having plenty of time at his disposal to slash and cut the body in all directions, evidently under the influence of a frenzy. Conceding that, in the respect of the indoor murder of Mary Kelly, the killing of the Pinchin Street victim had also been committed indoors, probably in the lodging of the murderer. Monroe went on to stress that in the latter case, there is no sign of frenzied mutilation of the body, but a deliberate and skillful dismemberment with a view of removal. Monroe then went on to point out that there were all very striking departures from the practice of the Whitechapel murderer, and if the body had been found elsewhere in that Whitechapel, the supposition that death had been caused by the Ripper would probably not have been entertained. In conclusion, Monroe stated, I am inclined to believe that, taking one thing with another, this is not the work of the Whitechapel murderer. The final victim whose name appears in the Whitechapel murder files is that of Frances Coles. Her body was discovered at 2:15 a.m. on Friday the 13th of February 1891 by Police Constable Ernest Thompson as he was passing through the archway of the Great Eastern Railway, which led to Swallow Gardens to Ormond Street. Thomas had passed the spot 15 minutes before and was adamant that the body hadn't been there. Returning at 2:15 a.m., he heard a man's footstep walking away from him, and looking into the arch, he noticed a figure laying on the ground. Shining his lamp onto it, he found, to his horror, that it was a body of a woman and that she was lying in a pool of blood, which was flowing from a terrible wound in her throat that ran from ear to ear. Thompson immediately blew his whistle and raised the alarm to the neighboring beat officers, P.C. Hyde and P.C. Hilton, who came running to the scene. They were soon joined by Police Constable Elliott, who was on plainclothes duty in the adjacent Royal Mint Street. Elliott later stated that shortly after 2 o'clock he had heard a whistle blown, and on going to Swallow Gardens saw a constable with his lamp turned on the body of a woman. He later stated that he was certain that he would have heard any cry from a woman, but everything had been very quiet until he heard the whistles. Checking for signs of life, the officer found the body to be quite warm, and they also felt a very faint pulse. P.C. Hyde was then sent to fetch the little medic, Dr. Oxley, who arrived at the scene and pronounced life extinct. P.C. Hilton, meanwhile, headed off to the police station to fetch a senior officer. He returned with Inspector Flanagan, who promptly ordered the police officers who were now there arriving at the scene to search the area and to stop and question anybody who they thought suspicious or who might have been able to provide any information. Meanwhile, in accordance with instructions issued during the murders of '88, Flanagan ordered the body was to remain in the position in which it was discovered, and then he carried out an in-depth search of the surrounding area for clues. Soon, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, the divisional police surgeon, had arrived at the scene, and upon examining the body, found 2 cuts to the woman's throat, which he stated were sufficient account for death. Crucially, Phillips was of the opinion that the nature of the wound and the posture of the body did not connect this murder with the series of previous murders which were accompanied by mutilation. It was believed that Thomas Adler had killed Francis. On the Saturday morning, acting on the descriptions and information of various witnesses, including Sergeant Edwards, Detective Sergeant Don and Detective Gill tracked Sadler down to the Phoenix Beer House and arrested him. Sadler offered no resistance and was arrested and taken before Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson, who had cautioned him subject to the search and examination. Sadler admitting to having known Frances Coles and having also been in her company. However, he was adamant that he had nothing to do with the murder. There were reports in the press that the cut on Frances Coles' throat was very like the cut on Alice Mackenzie's throat, and there was evidently some suspicion that he might also have been responsible for that crime, if not the other Whitechapel murders. On the 24th of February of 91, Sadler appeared at the Thames Police Court charged with willfully causing the death of Frances Cole by cutting her throat with a knife on the 13th. On February 27th of 91, the inquest into Frances Cole's death drew to its conclusion. The coroner, Wayne Baxter, told the jury that the case had many characteristics in common with the murders that would previously preceded it, but it was with the jury to decide, taking well into consideration Sadler's drunken condition, the conflicting evidence as to the times and the connected account given by him and his movements before and after the murder was committed, whether they could fairly charge him with the deed or must attribute it to some person or persons unknown. The jury retired to consider the verdict, and upon return the foreman said, "We find that the deceased was willfully murdered by some person or persons unknown, and we wish to say that we think the police did their duty in detaining Sadler." For a time, it seemed as though Sadler's guilt in connection with the murder of Frances Cole was proven, and there was speculation that Jack the Ripper may have well been caught at last. But then the case of him fell apart. Sadler was able to prove that he had indeed been mugged, and that he was not actually had been with Frances Cole in the hours before she was murdered. When it was also revealed that the knife that he had was probably too blunt to have inflicted the wound on Cole's throat, the case against him collapsed. He was also able to prove that he had been at sea when some of the other murders had occurred. In early March of 91, the Director of Public Prosecutions wrote to Sadler's solicitors informing them that, so far as the prosecution is concerned, it is not intended to offer evidence tomorrow before the magistrates herein, and the application will be made to him to permit the adoption of this court. On Tuesday, the 3rd of March of 91, Sadler again appeared before the magistrate. The prosecution told the court that, having had the advantage of the consultation with the learned Attorney General, who has carefully considered the evidence given in the course of the inquiry before the coroner, as well as most able summing up to the jury impaneled before him, and having regarded at the verdict returned by that jury, after a patient and exhaustive inquiry, I do not propose, on the materials at present or in our possession, to proceed further with this prosecution, and, sir, if it should meet with your approval, it will have the sanction both that the learned Attorney General and of the Treasury authorities that no further evidence should now be offered against the accused. And with that statement, Sadler was released and cleared of all charges relating to the murder of Frances Cole. One of the more bizarre aspects of the Jack the Ripper case is the number of letters that the police, newspapers, authorities, and notable citizens received from anonymous members of the public, either offering information on the best way to apprehend the killer, or else purporting to come from the murderer himself. It was the arrival of a gloating letter posted to the London news agency in September of '88 that would introduce the name Jack the Ripper into the saga. The letter in question was received by the Central News Agency in their premises of the City of London on the 27th of September, 1888. At first, the staff of the news agency weren't too concerned about a letter, and it would be 2 days before, on September 29th, that they would decide to pass it to the Metropolitan Police. The letter, written in a boastful tone, was addressed to The Boss, Central News Office, London City. It reads as follows. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them until I get buckled. Grand work the last job, boys. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear from me in my funny little games. I have saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fitting up, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do shall clip the ladies' ears off and send them to police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife, so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it, no luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha! On October 12th, George Lusk received a letter that, reportedly, was written in the same hand as that as the Dear Boss missive. I write you a letter in black ink, as I have no more of the right stuff. I think you were all asleep in Scotland Yard with your bloodhounds, as I will show you tomorrow night, Saturday. I am going to do a double event, but not in Whitechapel. Got rather too warm there. Had to shift. No more till you hear from me again. Jack the Ripper. George Lusk was doubtless becoming decidedly unnerved by the amount of attention he was beginning to receive to the more unsavory elements of the East End society. His nervousness no doubt increased when the taunting postcard arrived in the mail. Say, boss, you seem rare frightened. Guess I'd give you the fits, but you can't stop enough to let the box of toys play copper games with me. But I hope to see you when I don't hurry much. Bye-bye, boss. On Tuesday, October 16th of '88, a small package wrapped in brown paper and bearing an indistinct London postmark was delivered to Lusk in the Evening Post. It was addressed to him by name and bore the name of the street, but not give his house number. The parcel contained a foul-smelling piece of kidney together with a letter, the handwriting of which was the same as that of the postcard Lusk had received a few days before. From hell, Mr. Lusk. Sore. I sent you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you, 2 other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk. The murder spree of Jack the Ripper was a grisly chapter in the history of forensic science. Some of the methods developed in the pursuit of this killer are still used today. The landmark case for crime reported, creating the first known major media crime sensation, which started locally, then spread across much of the world. It's a forensic analysis that began in the late 1880s and is still ongoing today. This case presented the need for such careful forensic practices as some important evidence was destroyed in the name of decency. In the case of Mary Nichols, her body was discovered with her skirt pulled over her waist, so the 2 gentlemen who discovered her pulled her skirt down, possibly damaging evidence. The police received a letter from someone claiming to be the killer and signed Jack the Ripper. This letter was released to the public and it spurred many copycats, presumably hoping to gain some notoriety. It was later decided that the initial letter was also fake. The effort to track down all the authors to conclude that they were not indeed Jack the Ripper pulled important man-hours from the already daunting case. The scenes were not secured and the people were allowed to trample all over the scene of each murder, including the police themselves. So vital and minuscule cues that might have led them to the perpetrator could easily have been trampled into the ground, or simply not noticed in the confusion in the aftermath of the discovery of the victim. In the case of Annie Chapman's murder, the coroner's office was given strict instructions to not do anything with the body that would destroy evidence. Within 2 hours, acting on the instruction of the clerk of the workhouse guardians, 2 nurses stripped and washed the body before the postmortem could take place. In the Eddowes case, a note was written on the wall in chalk stating, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Believing this case would cause anti-Semitic hate crimes and the fact that the shop would soon be opening, the police opted to hastily write down the message and have it removed before photographers could arrive. Upon further analysis of the grammar of the letter, it was believed that the author was possibly Jewish and a non-English speaker who wrote the message that threw off the investigators. A great public uproar over the failure to arrest the murderer was raised against the Home Secretary and the London Police Commissioner, who had resigned soon afterwards. The number of Jack the Ripper suspects now runs well over 100. Some of them are hardly possible contenders for the mantle of Jack the Ripper. Others are just downright ridiculous. In the early days, the police appear to have believed that the crimes had been carried out by one of the local gangs, and thus their investigations focused on those so-called high-rip gangs. However, by early September of '88, the police had come to the conclusion that, were the local gangs responsible, the publicity and panic that the murderers had generated would have led one of the members to inform on the others. By the time of the murder of Annie Chapman on the 8th of September of '88, the police seemed to have decided that they were in fact looking for a lone assassin and began seeking ways to bring him to justice. There was a great amount of speculation that the killer demonstrated some amount of medical or anatomical knowledge. To this end, the police began looking into the activities of several medical students who had spent time in asylums. However, this line of inquiry drew a blank as the movements of these students were accounted for and they were ruled out of the involvement in other crimes. Others disagreed that the murderer was demonstrating any great detail or degree of medical skill and opinionated that his abilities were little more than those of a butcher or slaughterman. The police therefore carried out extensive inquiries amongst the numerous local butchers and slaughterhouses. But yet again, nothing came of their investigations, and all the alibis checked out, and thus eliminating those interviewed as the subjects. Throughout the hunt for Jack the Ripper, the police remained convinced that they were looking for a suspect who lived in the district, and, on the whole, their inquiries and investigation focused on the neighborhood where the crimes were occurring. Over 2,000 interviews were carried out by the Victorian police officers. More than 300 people were actually investigated, and 80 people were detained in police custody. It is possible that Jack had been one of those people, but none of the interviews, investigations, or detentions yielded anything concrete that enabled the police to point a finger at one suspect and say that he was Jack the Ripper. Ever since the Jack the Ripper murders ended, suspect after suspect has been pulled forward and been responsible for them. Prince Albert, Edward Victor, Lewis Carroll, the Freemasons, and Dr. Bernardo are just a few of the more outlandish Jack the Ripper suspects to have been put forward. Others, such as Thomas Cutbush and Carl Fingenbaum, were put forward around the time of the murders, discarded as likely suspects, and then found themselves brought back into the frame thanks to modern research or their asylum records being open to the public. One of the most commonly cited suspects is Montague Druitt, a barrister and teacher with an interest in surgery who is said to have been insane, and who disappeared after the final murders and was later found dead. But on closer inspection of the case, the Druitt falls apart. One such hypothesis, it makes several fundamental errors in the information that is provided about Druitt. For one, it's 10 years out regards of Druitt's age, as Druitt was in fact 31, not 41 when he died. Secondly, although several of his family members were doctors, Druitt empathically wasn't. The statement states that the murderer's brain may give way altogether after his awful glut in Miller's Court and that he immediately committed suicide. This most certainly did not apply to Montague Druitt. Indeed, his mind was sound enough in the days that followed the murder of Mary Kelly for him to actively pursuing his career as a barrister. Furthermore, he continued to work as a teacher at Valentine School until his dismissal at the end of November, some 3 weeks after the death of Mary Kelly. Since he probably committed suicide around that time, it would seem likely that he killed himself in reaction to his dismissal. The most compelling evidence for Druitt's guilt is most certainly the fact that his own family apparently believed he had been the murderer. But on closer inspection, even this claim does not stand up to close scrutiny, as it appears to be based on hearsay and opposed to hard evidence. Their article doesn't say that the Druitt's family had any concrete proof that he was a Ripper, but only states that they had the suspicions about him. The suspicions weren't necessarily correct. Furthermore, the statement apparently did not hear any of the suspicions directly from the family, but, to quote its own words, "From private information, I have little doubt that this family believed him to be the Ripper." This private information may, therefore, have been little more than third-party hearsay. The biggest objection to Druitt as a viable suspect is that Inspector Abilene most certainly did not think he could have been the Ripper. In an interview with Paul Mall Gazette in 1903, Aberdeen is quoted as saying, "I know all about that story. But what does it amount to? Simply this. Soon after the last murder in Whitechapel, the body of a young doctor was found in the Thames. But there is absolutely nothing beyond the fact that he has been found at the time to incriminate him." Finally, nothing that is known about Druitt suggests that he was ever visited Whitechapel, nor that he had any knowledge of the area. Yet the case against him is dependent on possessing more information that the statement wished to reveal, and which it had claimed to have destroyed so as not to cause an uproar. Montague Druitt may have been Jack the Ripper, but equally he may have just simply been a tragic figure who, in taking his own life at around the time of the murders ended, ensured that his name came to the attention of police as they desperately sought the solution to the fate of the Whitechapel murderer. Michael Ostrog, a Russian criminal and physician who had been placed in the asylum because of his homicidal tendencies. Although his theory falls apart very quickly, Michael was arrested in France under one of the many aliases and held in custody from the 26th of July of 88 to the 18th of November of 88, on which date he was brought to trial. Given a 2-year prison sentence, he was held in the lunatic wing of a French prison until his release in November of 1890. Since this is a crucial period over which the Ripper murders occurred, it would be intended to rule him out as a suspect. Several other notable Londoners of the area, such as painter Walter Sickert and the physician Sir William Gull, has also been the subject of much speculation. Jeff Mudgett, a lawyer and former commander of the U.S. Naval Reserve, claimed that his great-great-grandfather, H.H. Holmes, was in fact Jack the Ripper. Mudgett bases his assertions on the writings in the 2 diaries he inherited from Holmes, which detail Holmes' participation in the murder and mutilation of numerous prostitutes in London. The trail of the Ripper murders end at the start of 1891, and Holmes' murder spree is thought to begin at the end of 1891. So they could be the same person. The times works out conveniently for Holmes to travel between England and America. During this gap, shipwreckers show that a H. Holmes made this journey, making it plausible that this could be the same H. Holmes as the one who ran the murder castle. Holmes was renowned for being a document keeper. However, between 88 and 91, the time of the Ripper murders, Holmes had no documents and there was no trace where he was. Despite beliefs that the Ripper was a messy killer, he was methodical with his killings. Although not on the same meticulous level as Holmes' castle, this could have been the lead up to Holmes to develop his killing style. Jack's final victim, being found in a bed, suggests a progression to no longer committing random murders in the street. Both killers had removed their victims' organs. Holmes was a qualified doctor, and the Ripper had been believed to have some medical training. Sketches of what the Ripper supposedly looked like, drawn from the testimonies of over 13 witnesses who saw the Ripper in action, eerily match photos of Holmes. For Jeff Mudgett, Holmes' great-great-grandson, who believes him that the Ripper and Holmes were the same person, the similarity is close enough that, were the case happening today, it would warrant an arrest. Finally, the infamous Dear Boss letter written by the Ripper, in which he first gives the title Jack the Ripper and sent to the Central News Agency in 88, is thought by linguistics to have an American idioms. The letter gloats about murders already attributed to the same killer, known previously as the Whitechapel murderer, amongst other names. Should Holmes and the Ripper be the same person, it would make sense as to why the letter appeared to be written by an American. Despite what seems to be a lot of evidence for the 2 killers being the same person, a lot of it can be picked apart. None of the evidence is solid enough to pinpoint the 2 men as being one person. It is merely circumstantial. Moreover, many people believe that the Dear Boss letter wasn't written by the killer, but a journalist or a local looking to create more action. Holmes was a common name in the 19th century, so it does not prove that H. Holmes of the murder castle was in England at the time of the Ripper killings. Holmes was also known to go by different names. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. It could have been coincident that another H. Holmes was traveling to America in 91. Lastly, while Holmes sought to gain life insurance money from his victims, thus fueling his greed, the Ripper murdered the poor. There was no financial gain for the Ripper to be carrying out his murders, and so did not murder for the same reason as Holmes supposedly did. If the motives are different, then the murderers could be too. Could Jack have been a woman? The idea wasn't completely overlooked at the time. In fact, Detective Frederick Aberline was involved in the case at the time. Once said that he had pondered, do you think it could have been the case that not Jack the Ripper, but Jill the Ripper? His idea was based on the murder could have been a female midwife. You see, at the time of Mary Jane Kelly's death, believed to have been the Ripper's victim, she was thought to have been pregnant. Kelly was extensively mutilated and, like the others, was killed at home. A midwife would have easy access to the woman's house and could have easily slipped away relatively unseen. She would also have some of the knowledge shown in the mutilations performed on the victims and would have attracted little attention if seen covered in blood. It's not exactly concrete proof, but it is something worth thinking about. The first and most common potential, Jill, is Mary Percy, although her name wasn't brought up in the Ripper case until after she was executed for another crime in 1890. Her conviction had been for the murder of her lover's wife and their 18-month-old child. Those murders were particularly brutal and shared some similarities and characteristics with the Ripper murders, but there was never any suggestion as a motive that would tie her to the Ripper crimes. A retired lawyer in Ireland wrote in a book in which he suggested the culprit was Lizzie William, a wife of John Williams, who had also been a suspect. The author posited that Lizzie killed the prostitutes out of her own despair over her infertility, and several of the Ripper's victims had their wombs removed. He further points out that none of the victims had been sexually assaulted, and that one of the victims, Annie Chapman, had her possessions arranged at her feet in a feminine manner. One of the more popular theories on why Jack could have been a woman was because during the time the women were not able to get the education in medicine like men were. Therefore, it leads many to believe that the woman committed these killings to get a body to work on and study. This theory is backed by the brutal mutilation of Mary Kelly and the removal of Annie Chapman's womb. Now let's look at who was most likely the person who was Jack the Ripper. Genetic testing points to Aaron Kaminsky, a 23-year-old Polish Jew and resident of Whitechapel who was known to have a great animus towards women, particularly prostitutes, and whom was hospitalized in an asylum several months after the last murder. But critics say the evidence isn't strong enough to declare the case closed. The results come from a forensic examination of a stained silk shawl that investigators said was found next to the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes, the killer's fourth victim. The shawl is speckled with what's claimed to be blood and semen, the latter believed to be from the killer. David Miller, a reproduction and sperm expert at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom, claims it is the most systematic and most advanced genetic analysis to date regarding the Jack the Ripper murders. They described extracting and amplifying the DNA from the shawl. The test compared fragments to the mitochondrial DNA, the portion of DNA inherited from one's own mother, retrieved from the shawl with samples taken from living descendants of Eddowes and Kaminsky. The DNA matches that of a living relative of Kaminsky, they concluded in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. The new tests are not the first attempt to identify Jack the Ripper from DNA. Several years ago, U.S. crime author Patricia Cornwell asked other scientists to analyze any DNA in samples taken from letters supposedly sent by the killer to the police. Based on that DNA analysis and other clues, she said that the killer was painter Walter Sickert, though many experts believe those letters to be fake. Another genetic analysis of letters claimed the murderer to have been a woman. Though this is a huge find for those seeking to find out who Jack the Ripper was, the evidence just isn't strong enough to make the case for Kaminsky, and almost all the other evidence towards others are circumstantial at best. The press played a pivotal role in creating the public image of the Whitechapel murderer. Armed with his horrifying nickname, Jack the Ripper, journalists quickly fashioned a terrifying figure to cast blame on. Without a clear target, the press were forced to label the killer with haunting titles such as monster or fiend, adding an almost supernatural element to the killer's reputation. Through these fleeting descriptions, and racial and social tensions were heightened. A few eyewitness reports to be printed often labeled the man as having a dark complexion, black beard, black coat, and foreign-looking, a description of a typical Jewish man living in the East End at the time. Jack the Ripper has provided themes for numerous literary and dramatic works. Perhaps the most notable was the horror novel The Lodger in 1913 by Mary Adelaide Lowndes, which inspired numerous films, including Alfred Hitchcock's The Lodger, a story of the London fog in 1927. Stephen Knight's 1976 work Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, which expanded on the conspiracy theory involving the Freemasons and royalty. The literature of the late Victorian era included Arthur Conan Doyle's first Sherlock Holmes stories, and Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, has provided inspiration for storymakers who have fused these fictional worlds with the Ripper. The Ripper makes appearances throughout sci-fi and horror genres as an intentionally recognized as an evil character. The association of the Ripper with death and sex is particularly appealing to heavy metal and rock musicians who have incorporated the Ripper murders into their work. There's more than 100 books about the case have been published, many of which offer conjectures as to the true identity of the murderer and the circumstances surrounding the crimes, including that the murderers were part of an occult or Masonic plot, and that the police were covering up for highly placed culprits, perhaps even members of the royal family. The best known of these conspiracy theory works is Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's award-winning graphic novel From Hell, which went from 91 to 96, which was later adapted to a 2001 movie starring Johnny Depp. Many of these books, however, are based on fraudulent claims and documents. We may never know who the actual Jack the Ripper was, but rest assured, we will never forget the terror his killers brought to the streets of Whitechapel all those many years ago.